The air was thick with late summer heat as the Whitmore family arrived at the trailhead of Black Hollow Preserve. It was August 3rd, 2001. The dirt parking lot crackled under the tires of their aging green Ford Explorer as Alan turned off the engine and reached for the trail map. Beside him, Marianne was gently brushing cookie crumbs off her lap, glancing toward the rearview mirror where their two children sat in the back. Katie, age 9, was already tugging at her backpack straps, eager to get out and explore. Jonah, just 7, was busy inspecting a small worn-out camcorder he'd inherited from his uncle. It was the kind of bulky early 90s model that recorded on mini-tapes, and while mostly forgotten by the modern world, it was Jonah's most prized possession. Alan stepped out first, stretching his arms and rolling his neck. He breathed in the sharp, piney air and looked around. The trail was quiet. No other cars. Just the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes and the gentle rustle of trees bending under the weight of cicada songs. Black Hollow was one of those lesser-known state preserves buried deep in the Catskills, half forgotten and barely marked on tourist maps. It had been Marianne's idea to come here. She had read about it in an obscure nature magazine that mentioned scenic waterfalls and untouched landscapes. More importantly, it was quiet. That was the point. They needed quiet. Marianne had been uneasy for months. She said the city felt wrong lately. Not unsafe exactly, just off. There had been that night when the neighbor's dog barked for hours and no one could figure out why. Then the strange man who kept circling their block and never spoke. And most recently, the envelope that arrived with no return address and only one thing inside a blank cassette tape. No explanation, no note, just static when they tried to play it. Alan dismissed most of it as city paranoia, but deep down, even he couldn't explain the feeling that something unseen had been brushing against the edges of their lives. That's why this trip wasn't just a getaway. It was an escape. A brief pause in a life that had started to feel scripted and brittle. They adjusted their backpacks and locked the car. Jonah clutched the camcorder in his small hands, filming everything with a seriousness far beyond his years. The crunch of leaves, his mother's soft voice warning him not to trip, his sister laughing and darting ahead on the trail. The sun flickered through the dense canopy, throwing fractured patterns on the dirt path, and the family began their hike into the woods. The first hour was uneventful in the best way. The trail was narrow but manageable, winding upward into higher terrain. Wildflowers poked through the underbrush and the occasional squirrel darted across their path. Katie pretended to be a nature guide, naming every bird she didn't know with made-up Latin names. Jonah documented it all, even panning upward toward a break in the trees where the light filtered in golden and warm. At the 2-mile mark, they found a small clearing with a mossy bench. Alan checked the map. There was a split in the trail ahead, left toward the lake, which was their intended destination. Right toward something labeled only as Observation Point. Marianne voted for the lake. Katie agreed. Jonah didn't. He pointed the camcorder at the right fork and asked what Observation Point meant. Alan chuckled and told him it probably just meant a nice view. Maybe they'd check it out tomorrow. They went left. About half a mile later, they heard water. The lake shimmered through the trees, a sheet of blue-gray glass reflecting the rising sun. They reached a flat area near the edge and laid out their things. Sandwiches, juice boxes. Marianne opened a novel she had brought, but her eyes didn't move across the page. She kept looking across the lake as if expecting something. Jonah wandered near the water's edge, crouching to film bugs crawling over stones. Katie collected pine cones and tried to build a sculpture shaped like a rabbit. Alan dozed off, hat pulled over his eyes. Then came the first strange moment. Jonah pointed his camcorder at the far side of the lake. He said he saw something move in the trees. A figure. Not animal, not quite human either. Marianne stood and looked, and there was nothing there. Alan woke up and said it was probably a deer, but Jonah insisted. He rewound the tape and played it. Static, then a second of footage, the trees, the still water, and a flicker of something dark just between two trunks, a shape. Then more static. They brushed it off. Told him the tape was probably damaged. Jonah said it wasn't. He had filmed the exact same scene earlier and it played back just fine. They watched the earlier clip. It showed a clear, still landscape, no movement, no figure. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to head back, Jonah tucked the camera into his bag. Katie complained of a headache. She said the lake made her feel heavy, like the water was trying to pull her thoughts out. Marianne looked uneasy but said nothing. Alan joked that it was just the altitude. They took the same trail back. By the time they returned to the car, the sun was already dropping. Shadows stretched along across the lot. Still, no other vehicles, no other hikers. As Alan unlocked the car, Jonah turned on the camcorder again, just to check. The screen lit up, a new file, one he didn't remember recording. It was labeled 7:13 p.m., but no one had used the camcorder since the lake. He clicked play. The footage was shaky. It showed the forest, but it was darker than it should have been. The branches swayed violently, though there had been no wind, and in the corner of the frame, just for a second, something stepped into view. A bare foot. Human. Covered in ash. Jonah dropped the camcorder. Alan asked what was wrong, but the boy couldn't speak. Marianne picked it up, pressed rewind, but the file was gone. They left Black Hollow that evening in silence. That night the dream started. The air in the motel room felt still and heavy, as if the mountain silence had followed them down from Black Hollow. Alan and Marianne had picked a modest place on the outskirts of a nearby town called Elmsfield. The room had 2 beds covered in faded floral spreads and a bulky old television that buzzed softly even when turned off. Alan fell asleep quickly, as he often did after driving for hours. Katie and Jonah lay side by side in the second bed. Marianne stayed awake longest, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking the spine of her book, but her eyes never moving across the page. When she finally turned off the light, the room fell into complete darkness. Outside, the wind rustled dry leaves across the pavement, but inside, the silence returned. Sometime after midnight, Jonah stirred first. He did not sit up. He did not cry out. He simply opened his eyes and stared into the darkness. The room looked exactly the same, but it felt different. He could not hear the television buzz anymore. The window curtains no longer fluttered. A shape stood at the foot of the bed, tall and unmoving. It was not Alan. It was not Marianne. It had no face that he could see, but he felt its eyes. They were not angry. They were not even cold. They were expectant, as if it had been waiting a very long time. Jonah tried to speak, but no sound came out. His body would not move. His chest rose and fell, but slowly, as if under water. The shape leaned forward ever so slightly, then it raised one hand. The fingers were thin and long and smeared with something dark. It pointed to the camcorder sitting on the dresser. Then the room was empty. The buzz of the TV returned. The air shifted back into place. Jonah sat up, gasping. A cry escaped him this time and woke Katie. She looked at him with tired eyes but did not ask what was wrong. She reached out and touched his arm. He did not pull away. They sat like that until morning. When the family woke for breakfast, Jonah did not mention the dream. Marianne looked at him more than once with a searching expression. Alan sipped his coffee and read a local newspaper as if trying to keep the world logical by force. Katie picked at her food. She said nothing about the way her dreams had shifted too. She remembered water. Cold, black water rushing over her feet even though she was standing in a forest. She remembered whispers in a language she did not know but felt inside her ribs like an echo. They decided to hike again. Alan insisted they keep the schedule. One more day, they would visit the observation point trail they skipped yesterday. He said it with cheer, but nobody responded. The drive back to Black Hollow was quiet. The car climbed the same winding road, the same trees, the same brittle silence. When they reached the parking lot, it was empty again. Jonah held the camcorder tighter than ever. The observation point trail was narrower, less maintained. Moss crept up the wooden marker at the entrance. The path climbed fast, turning rocky and shaded. They walked in single file. Jonah in front, filming the path. Katie next moving slower than usual. Alan behind her watching the trees more than the trail. Marianne brought up the rear. Her eyes rarely blinked. The forest seemed to shift around them. The deeper they went, the darker it felt, even though the sun was high above. After about an hour, they reached a small rise where the trees broke just enough to show the valley beyond. But something else stood there too. A stone marker, weathered and cracked with a circle carved into it. No words. Just that single circle. Alan asked if it was part of the park. Marianne said she had seen nothing about it in the magazine article. Jonah filmed it closely. As he moved around it, the sun caught the stone, and for a brief second it shimmered with something red. When he looked up, he saw that same shape again between the trees. Watching. They turned back shortly after. The mood was heavier. Katie began to hum under her breath. A song she did not recognize. Marianne walked closer to her daughter, now occasionally touching her back. Jonah kept glancing behind them. Alan tried to lead with confidence, but even he started checking the trail markers more often. When they returned to the car, it was mid-afternoon. The clouds had thickened. Rain scented the air. They drove back to Elmsfield. That night, the dreams came again, this time for all of them. Jonah dreamed he was walking through the forest alone. The trees were taller, and their bark pulsed like breathing skin. He heard his name, but not from a voice. It came from inside his head in the rhythm of his heartbeat. He saw the lake again, but now the surface was dry, cracked earth. A single shoe sat in the middle of it, a child's shoe, his own. Katie dreamed of water again. But this time she was in it, floating just beneath the surface. She could see the sky, but it was upside down. Something floated toward her, a face she could almost recognize, but it was her own face, pale, eyes open, lips moving. No sound. Alan dreamed of the stone marker. He stood before it, alone. He traced the circle with his finger and it burned. When he pulled his hand back, the skin was gone. Only bone remained. He woke, sweating. The bedsheets twisted around him like vines. Marianne dreamed of the camera. It floated above her bed, spinning slowly. She reached for it, and when her fingers touched it, she saw flashes. Jonah screaming. Katie drowning. A dark figure kneeling at the foot of her bed, whispering not yet. They all woke in silence. None of them spoke of the dreams. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer absence of noise. It was presence of something waiting. The morning broke with a low rumble of thunder somewhere in the distance. The sky over Elmsfield was the color of wet stone, and the motel curtains stirred in the breeze, slipping through the cracked window. Marianne stood at the sink brushing her hair with slow, distracted strokes. Her reflection looked foreign. Pale cheeks, tired eyes. She could not remember falling asleep, but she remembered the dream. Every part of it. The camcorder hovering above her, the voice that had no shape. She had not told Alan, she would not tell the children, but something had changed overnight. In the other room, Alan sat at the small motel table, scrolling through the camera menu. Jonah had left the device on the dresser screen, still lit as if it refused to power down. Alan tapped through the clips. There were dozens now, some he remembered, some he did not. Most were silent. Trees, dirt paths, the lake. But near the end he found a file labeled simply with today's date. He furrowed his brow. He had not used the camcorder that morning. He had not heard Jonah use it either. He clicked play. The footage began with a forest. Not unusual. The branches swayed gently. Then the frame shifted, as if someone had turned the camera slowly toward a clearing. There stood the stone marker from yesterday. But the carving had changed. The circle now had lines etched inside it. 4 thin lines that intersected like compass points. Then the image flickered. The angle shifted again. Someone walked into the frame. A girl. She wore Katie's hoodie. She stood motionless with her back to the camera. Then the screen went black. Alan blinked. He played it again. The same sequence. The same eerie silence. He called to Jonah, who was tying his shoes on the floor. Jonah looked up but said nothing. Alan asked him if he had filmed anything that morning. Jonah shook his head. Alan turned the camera toward him. The boy flinched before composing himself. He said maybe the file was old. Maybe it had been mislabeled. Alan did not press him. He powered off the camera and set it aside, but when he looked down again, the light was still on. Marianne emerged from the bathroom and asked if they had plans for the day. Alan said maybe they should go into town, see if there was a library or a historical society. Maybe someone knew more about the park. Marianne agreed. She turned toward Katie, who had been quietly flipping through a comic book by the window. Katie nodded and said she wanted to come. Her voice was too even, too flat. Jonah said nothing but picked up the camera and slipped it into his backpack without being asked. Elmsfield was small. The streets were lined with shops that looked abandoned even when open, a diner, a general store, a post office with a broken flagpole. They found the library on Main Street wedged between a laundromat and a boarded-up antiques shop. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp carpet. A woman sat behind the desk reading a large print mystery novel. She glanced up as they entered and offered a polite nod. Alan asked if there were any local history records. The woman pointed to a narrow room at the back. They stepped inside and found shelves of binders and yellowing newspapers stacked in metal drawers. Marianne began flipping through microfiche files. Alan scanned headlines from the 80s and 90s. Missing hikers, lightning storms, a small fire that consumed a ranger cabin near Black Hollow in 1992. Jonah wandered between the stacks. Katie stood still near the window, her hand pressed to the glass. Jonah found a folder labeled Black Hollow Preserve 1973 to 2000. Inside were hand-typed ranger reports, trail maintenance logs, weather patterns. At the bottom was a single Polaroid clipped to a faded report. The photo showed the stone marker, but the circle was clean. No inner lines. The report mentioned it had no known origin. Locals called it the Watcher Stone, said it had always been there. Jonah took the photo to his mother. Marianne stared at it for a long time. Then she asked the librarian if there were any records older than 1973. The woman shook her head. She said the preserve had only been recognized as state property that year. Before that, it was just woods, private lands, family farms mostly abandoned after the war. She said some people believed the woods had belonged to someone long before any settlers arrived, someone who never left. The drive back to the motel was quiet. Katie leaned her head against the window. Her eyes followed something beyond the glass, though no one else could see it. Jonah held the Polaroid tightly in his lap. Alan glanced at the camera in the rearview mirror. It was in Jonah's lap. The light was still on. Back in the room, Jonah opened the camera menu again. Another new file had appeared, labeled with the exact time they were in the library. He played it. The footage showed the motel room, their motel room. Except no one was inside. The curtains swayed, the beds were untouched. The camera panned slowly across the walls, then stopped at the mirror. In the reflection stood a woman, not Marianne, not anyone they knew. Her back was to the glass, her head tilted at a strange angle. Then the screen went black again. That night the rain began to fall. It started softly, then grew heavier. The family sat in silence inside the cramped motel room, the air thick with tension. The TV played some cooking show no one was watching. Suddenly, the screen flickered, turned to static, buzzing high, then low, before falling completely silent. Without anyone touching it, the old camcorder powered on. Its screen lit up. Katie stood slowly as if pulled by something unseen, her hands moving like they were underwater. She pressed play. The footage showed the four of them walking, not on a path but in a straight line through the trees. Their eyes were open, their mouths moved, but there was no sound. The video ended on a single frame, the stone marker. The four carved lines on it now glowing red. The next morning began in silence. No birds sang. No wind stirred the trees outside the motel. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the clouds hung low and unmoving. Alan stood by the window sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. He had not slept. Neither had Marianne. They both lay in bed all night pretending not to hear the low whir of the camcorder still running on the table. Jonah had tucked it under his pillow at one point, but the light never faded. It burned red through the blanket like a heartbeat. Katie sat in the corner tracing shapes into the moisture on the window pane. Her face was pale but calm. She looked like a child waiting for a school bus that would never arrive. Alan suggested they take one final hike. He said it without emotion. Just a quiet statement passed over a table of uneaten toast and cold eggs. Marianne said nothing but gathered their bags. Jonah carried the camcorder. Katie walked barefoot until Marianne made her put on shoes. They drove back to Black Hollow without speaking. The parking lot was empty again. The trail was slick and soft from the rain. This time they chose neither the lake path nor the observation trail. Alan spotted an unmarked trail near the lot. It was narrow, the grass had grown high and wet along the path, but there were old wooden posts leaning in the ground suggesting it had once been used. He said maybe it was an old ranger trail. Marianne glanced at Jonah, who had already begun filming again. She nodded. They entered the woods. The path curved slowly downhill. The trees here were different. Taller, the bark darker. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled their steps. The deeper they walked, the less sound followed them. No birds, no rustling, not even the distant hum of wind. It felt like walking through a room sealed by glass. The trail narrowed further and eventually disappeared altogether, but Alan kept walking as if led by something unseen. The others followed. After about an hour, Jonah stopped. He looked through the camcorder's viewfinder and adjusted the zoom. He said nothing. Marianne stepped beside him and followed his gaze. There was something up ahead. A wall, not stone, not wood, something darker. A structure hidden between the trees. As they approached, they saw it clearly. A building, partially sunk into the hillside. The roof sloped downward. The door stood open. It was a ranger station, or what remained of one. The paint had peeled to the bone, the windows were gone. The air smelled like old ash and wet earth. Alan stepped inside first. His boots creaked on the warped floorboards. The room inside was small, a desk, a single wooden chair, a rusted stove in one corner. On the wall hung a faded map of the preserve. But it looked different from the ones Alan remembered. The trails were not the same. One path curved in a loop that circled a symbol near the center. A circle with 4 spokes, the same as the stone. Marianne stepped closer and reached out to touch the map. The paper crumbled under her fingers. Behind it was another layer, a second map. Hand-drawn, older, the same trail, the same symbol, but this one had names. Names of families. Whitmore was one of them. Written near the edge. Dated 1954. She staggered back. Her voice cracked for the first time that day. Alan stared at the name but said nothing. Katie walked to the stove and opened the rusted door. Inside were fragments of something burned. Paper, cloth, plastic, a melted cassette. Jonah turned the camera toward the window. Through the broken glass he saw the stone, not the one from the trail, another, nearly identical. But this one had more lines. 8 now, radiating outward, each glowing faintly even in daylight. Suddenly, the camera shut off. The light died. The air shifted. Outside, the forest darkened. Alan stepped back to the doorway. He turned to tell the others it was time to go, but he could not see the trail. The path they came in on was gone. In its place stood trees, close and twisted. New growth that had not been there minutes before. Panic rose. He told them to stay close. They moved together into the woods. Jonah held the camcorder even though it no longer worked. Katie whispered something under her breath. Marianne gripped her daughter's hand. Alan moved in front, carving a way through the underbrush with a broken branch. After 20 minutes, they reached a clearing. It was perfectly circular. The grass was short and dry. In the center stood the original stone marker, the one from their first hike. Only now it pulsed. Faint light breathed in and out from the carvings. It felt warm and alive. Katie let go of Marianne's hand and walked toward it. Alan called to her, but she did not stop. She knelt and placed her hand on the stone. The wind returned. A sound like a sigh moved through the trees. The light from the stone flared once, then dimmed. Katie stood and turned. Her eyes were different. No fear, no confusion, only calm. She said they had to finish the path. Alan asked what path. Katie pointed into the woods. Jonah raised the camcorder. The screen blinked back on. Footage began to play. It was them, walking in a line. Katie in front. Marianne behind her, then Alan. Then Jonah holding the camera. Following the same path through the trees. But the footage did not stop. It kept going. Ahead in the video they reached another stone, one with 12 lines. Katie stopped in the video and turned to the camera. Her lips moved. She said something, but the audio was gone. The screen flickered, then the footage continued. The family vanished behind the trees. Only the path remained. Jonah lowered the camera. Alan looked at the others. He asked what they should do. Katie said they had to follow it. It was already made. The path they followed now felt less like a trail and more like a tunnel carved through the woods by invisible hands. The trees bent inward. The light above faded into a dull gray. Each step felt slower, heavier, as if the forest itself resisted their movement. Jonah kept the camcorder pressed to his chest. The screen no longer showed anything but a dull glow. Yet he still held it like a compass. Katie walked ahead, never hesitating, her eyes focused and unblinking. She did not speak unless spoken to, and even then her answers came as soft as wind. Alan moved cautiously, glancing behind them often. The trail had no turns, no intersections, just a straight passage forward. Marianne stayed near Jonah, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. They walked for what felt like hours. Time passed strangely now. The air never changed. The light never shifted. Eventually, the trees opened to another clearing. This one was different from the others. It was larger, almost perfectly circular, surrounded by smooth stones stacked waist-high, forming a low wall. At the center stood not one marker but a ring of them. 12 stones in a perfect circle, each carved with lines, each glowing faintly in the growing dusk. Katie approached first. She stepped between 2 stones and turned slowly in place as if waiting for something to speak to her. Marianne entered the circle next. She counted the stones silently, 12 in total. Each had a name carved at the base. The names were worn but readable. She walked slowly from one to the next, her lips moving without sound. Alan joined her, reading the names aloud under his breath. Jonah stood just outside the circle, recording again. The screen now showed shapes forming, fading, then forming again. Marianne stopped at one stone near the eastern arc. The name carved into it was Whitmore. Her voice trembled when she read it. Alan moved to her side. He reached out to touch the stone, but Katie spoke suddenly. She said not yet. Her voice was calm but final. Alan froze. He lowered his hand. Katie pointed toward the center of the ring. There, lying on the mossy ground, was a rusted metal box. Marianne stepped forward and knelt beside it. The box looked old, covered in dirt and lichen. It had no lock. She opened it slowly. Inside was a stack of weathered photographs, black and white, faded color. All showed people standing near the stones. Some smiled, some looked away. In each one the same circle appeared, always 12 stones. Always the same arrangement. Jonah stepped closer. He lifted one photograph and held it up to the light. The image showed a woman and 2 children. The woman stood behind them with her hand on one child's shoulder. Her eyes stared directly into the camera. Jonah handed the photograph to his mother. Marianne looked down at it and dropped it. Her knees gave out and she sat hard on the ground. The woman in the photograph was her, younger. The children beside her were Katie and Jonah, but their clothes were different, their faces unchanged. Alan picked up the photo. He stared at it without speaking. Then he looked to the next one in the stack. It showed a man and a boy walking into the woods. The boy held a camcorder. Jonah's hand trembled. He reached into the box and took out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed and delicate. Alan opened it carefully. The handwriting was uneven rushed. It read only one sentence. "The path loops if you let it. Do not touch the last stone." Katie walked slowly around the circle. She paused at each stone. She touched them lightly with her fingers but avoided the one marked Whitmore. She said she remembered now. Marianne asked what she meant. Katie said the path brought them back because they had never left. Not really. Not entirely. She said the circle was always waiting, always calling back its own. Jonah lowered the camera. He said there was one more file. He had not opened it. It had no label, just a blank title. He pressed play. The footage was in black and white. It showed the ranger station again intact and clean. A man sat at the desk. He looked up into the camera. He said he was sorry. He said the trail was made to hide what could not be forgotten. He said the stones were not graves. They were promises. The footage shifted to the circle. The camera moved through the stones. It approached the center. It paused on the Whitmore stone. A hand reached out to touch it. The screen turned white. Then nothing. The camera shut off again. Alan stood inside the circle. He said they needed to decide. He said the path would not let them go unless they chose. Marianne said they had already been chosen. Jonah whispered that the circle had their names now. Katie said the final stone could finish it, or start it again. Marianne looked at her children. Then she looked at Alan. She stepped to the edge of the circle and waited. Alan joined her. Jonah walked to stand beside them. Katie remained near the center. She placed both hands on the moss. The ground beneath her glowed faintly. She said they had come to the center. She said they could stay or turn back. But only one way would hold their shape. Alan asked what that meant. Katie looked at him and said the forest remembered everything, even dreams. Then the stones began to hum. The hum deepened beneath their feet as the family stood in the circle of stones. It no longer felt like a sound, but like a force, something alive under the earth resonating in their bones. Each stone pulsed with faint light except for one. The Whitmore stone remained cold and still, its carved name untouched by the glow. Katie knelt in the center, her hands pressed into the moss, her face tilted upward as if listening to a voice only she could hear. When she spoke, her voice did not carry the timbre of a child, but the steady cadence of someone who had waited a long time to be heard. She said the stones were not graves, not markers of endings, but doors left open. She said they were waiting for one last name to awaken. Marianne stepped forward, careful not to disturb the moss. She knelt beside her daughter and asked what happened when the stones awakened. Katie said the forest remembered what people forgot. She said it did not punish or trick. It listened. It waited. Alan stood at the edge of the circle, his eyes fixed on the silent stone with their name. He asked if touching it would complete something or begin something else. Katie said it depended on how the name was spoken. Marianne reached toward the stone but hesitated. Jonah watched everything through the lens of the camcorder, which hummed with a weak red light, even though the battery indicator blinked near empty. Alan walked slowly to the Whitmore stone. He crouched and looked at the name carved deep into its face. His voice was low when he spoke it aloud. The stone flickered once, then dimmed again. Jonah stepped beside him and repeated the name, a breath sharper this time. The stone glowed faintly. Katie said the forest had heard it. She said one more voice would open it fully. Marianne placed her hand on the stone and said the name. The light returned. The stone began to hum in sync with the others. The circle was complete now. All 12 stones pulsed with rhythm. The ground beneath them vibrated with the same deep frequency. Katie rose and stepped back from the center. The moss beneath where she had knelt began to shift not upward or outward, but in a slow inward spiral that seemed to form a pattern. Jonah captured the motion on the camcorder. He said it looked like a clock with no hands. The spiral continued to draw itself tighter, and from its center came a voice. Not loud, not sharp, a whisper layered under the hum. It said one word. Remember. Marianne stepped back. Her knees shook. Alan reached for her hand and held it. Katie said the voice was not asking. It was offering. Jonah said the camcorder had started recording on its own. He looked at the screen and saw them standing together in the circle. The footage was steady clear, but the sky in the image was lighter than the one above them now. In the footage, the family stepped out of the circle and began walking down a familiar trail. The footage moved with them as if filmed by someone behind them. It showed them reaching the car, driving home, returning to their apartment. It showed days passing years, small moments of peace, of laughter, of growing older together. Alan asked if it was real. Katie said it was memory, not theirs. The forest's. It kept what people gave it. Marianne asked if they had given this. Katie said maybe long ago. Maybe not yet. Jonah turned off the screen. The camcorder's light faded. The humming around them slowed. The light from the stones dimmed one by one, the glow fading in the same sequence that it had ignited, moving around the circle until only the Whitmore stone remained faintly lit. Then that too went dark. The moss settled. The spiral vanished. The forest exhaled. The wind returned first. Then the sound of birds. The light through the trees grew sharper, warmer. The stillness broke not with noise but with movement. A squirrel darted through the underbrush. Leaves shifted in the breeze. The clearing lost its weight. It became only a place in the woods again. Katie stepped out of the circle. The others followed without speaking. They walked slowly down the trail that had reappeared beyond the stones. It was narrow but familiar now. They did not rush. Each step felt lighter than the last. The woods no longer pressed in around them. They breathed again. When they reached the edge of the trail, the parking lot came into view. Their car waited untouched. The sun broke through the trees and touched the windshield. Alan walked to the driver's side and opened the door. Marianne paused and looked back once, but the trail behind them had already faded. Katie climbed into the back seat beside Jonah, who placed the camcorder on the floor. The screen remained dark. As they drove away, no one spoke for a long time. The trees passed by in a blur of green and gold. The road curved down the hill and away from the preserve. Jonah watched the treetops out the window. Marianne rested her head against the seat. Alan kept one hand on the wheel and the other on hers. Katie looked out at the woods and said the names would rest now. She said the stones would sleep. Alan asked how she knew. Katie said they had heard what they needed. Jonah reached down and touched the camcorder. It did not glow, it did not hum, it was only a machine now. They reached Elmsfield just before sunset. The golden light washed across the quiet streets and bathed the storefronts in a warm glow. The town looked unchanged but different. Alan slowed the car as they passed the diner. The open sign flickered softly in the window. A woman swept the front steps, her motion slow and methodical. She did not look up. Jonah leaned against the window, watching every detail with careful eyes. He whispered that it felt too still. Marianne nodded and said the town was holding its breath. They parked in front of the library, unsure why they came back. Something pulled them here. The same motion that brought them through the forest now guided their steps on concrete. Katie stepped onto the sidewalk first. She stared at the library door. The lights were on inside. Alan reached for the handle. The door opened without resistance. They entered. The same woman sat at the desk. Her hair was tied back the same way. Her book lay open to the same page, but she did not greet them. She looked up with eyes that did not register recognition. Alan said they had spoken before. He asked if she remembered. She blinked slowly and asked if they were new to town. Jonah stepped forward and asked if the history room still existed. The woman said they did not have one. She said no records went past 1970. She said the old building had flooded years ago. Marianne looked around. The place was the same. The chairs, the lamps, the lingering scent of paper and mildew, but the room with the microfilm had vanished. A wall now stood where the doorway once was. Katie turned toward the back of the library. She said the forest had not let go. It had only changed the lines. Jonah walked to the new wall and pressed his hand against it. Cold, solid, unmarked. Alan asked the librarian about the ranger station in Black Hollow. She said she had never heard of it. She said Black Hollow was closed. No longer on the maps. Marianne reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph they had taken from the box. She held it up. The woman stared at it, then shook her head. She said the people looked familiar, but she could not say why. They left the library in silence. The sky above was now a deeper orange, fading into violet. The town around them had slowed. A man watered flowers in front of the hardware store. A child rode a tricycle in circles near the general store. A dog barked once, then fell quiet. The air felt thick again, not with fear, with memory. Alan said they should find a place to sleep. They returned to the motel. Their room key still worked. The room was exactly as they left it. Beds untouched, window open, curtains stirring slightly. Jonah picked up the camcorder from the car. He placed it on the table. It did not blink. It did not whir. It sat like an ordinary object, heavy and silent. Katie walked to the mirror. She looked at her reflection. Then she touched the glass. Her fingers left no mark. She asked Marianne if they had really left the forest. Marianne said she did not know. That night no one dreamed. They lay in silence, each in their own bed. The air did not shift. No voice came from the floor. No light flickered under the door. At dawn they woke one by one. The room was bright. The motel was quiet. The world was still. Alan suggested they visit the post office. He wanted to send a letter. He said it felt necessary. The others followed. Inside the post office, the clerk behind the counter smiled. He asked how he could help. Alan asked if he could send a package. The clerk handed him a box. Alan placed the camcorder inside. He addressed it to himself. He used their home address. He said nothing as he sealed it shut. The clerk said the package would arrive in 3 days. Jonah asked how the clerk could guarantee that. The man shrugged and said he always did. Outside, the street felt warmer. The people moved slowly, but with purpose. The child on the tricycle had vanished. The flower pots had been rearranged. The town had shifted again. Marianne said she no longer recognized the buildings. She pointed to the cafe that used to sit near the laundromat. It was now a barber shop. The window displays were new. Jonah said he had filmed the street. He remembered every store. Now, half were gone. Katie said the forest was not behind them. It had followed them out. Alan drove them out of Elmsfield that afternoon. The road curved the same way, but the trees leaned differently. The signs were clean, the asphalt smooth. The forest no longer pressed against the road, but it remained close, watching, listening. When they reached the highway, Marianne looked back once. The town sign had changed. It no longer read Elmsfield, it read Hollow Bend. They drove until the sun dipped behind the hills. 3 days passed. The sun rose and fell without interruption. The city noise returned. The scent of pavement and exhaust replaced the moss and pine. Alan returned to work. Marianne unpacked suitcases, slowly folding shirts that still smelled faintly of earth. Katie sat by the window each afternoon watching children play in the courtyard below their building. Jonah stayed in his room with the blinds closed. The camcorder did not arrive. On the 4th morning, the mail carrier knocked. Alan answered the door. A small box sat in the carrier's hands. Alan signed for it without speaking. He closed the door gently and carried the box to the table. It was the same package he had sent in Elmsfield. Same tape, same handwriting. He peeled the tape off slowly. The box opened with a faint creak. Inside was the camcorder. It looked unchanged. No lights glowed. No sound came from it. He reached in and lifted it carefully. He pressed the power button. The screen lit up. There was a new file. He called the family into the living room. They sat in silence as he connected the camera to the television. The screen flickered. The footage began. It showed the front door of their apartment. The camera angle was low. It faced upward as if resting on the floor. The timestamp showed tomorrow's date. Jonah leaned forward. Katie tilted her head. The door opened in the video. Marianne stepped inside. She carried groceries. She placed the bags on the counter and turned. She looked toward the camera and smiled. Then she froze. The screen went black. The file ended. No sound. No fade. Just black. Alan said nothing. He turned off the television. The camcorder powered down again on its own. Marianne stood and walked to the window. The trees across the street swayed in the wind. The forest was not there, but it had not left. Katie asked if the footage meant something was coming. Alan said it could mean that they had been seen. Jonah said the forest might be watching through the camera. Marianne said they had changed the trail. Maybe the trail had changed them. They left the camcorder on the table. That night, none of them spoke at dinner. They ate slowly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of forks against plates. Jonah excused himself first. Katie followed. Marianne washed dishes. Alan dried them. At midnight, the camcorder turned on. No one touched it. No one was in the room. The screen showed the inside of the forest, the same trail, the same moss. A new figure walked alone between the trees. No face was visible, only a long coat, bare feet. The figure carried a lantern that emitted no light. The figure walked until it reached the stone circle. The stones were dim, the center was empty. Then the screen went black. The camcorder turned off. In the morning, Jonah discovered the new file. He did not play it, he deleted it. He told no one. At breakfast, Marianne asked about school. Katie said she did not want to go back. Jonah said he was not ready. Alan said they needed to decide what they had brought back with them. The city moved around them as if nothing had changed. Cars honked in the streets below. Neighbors carried groceries and greeted each other in passing. Children laughed on sidewalks. But inside the Whitmore apartment, everything felt off balance. The mirrors in the hallway reflected things as they should, yet Marianne noticed small shifts. A vase of flowers in the background sat at a different angle than she remembered arranging it. A coat sleeve in a reflection moved when no one passed. She adjusted the frame, stared again, and saw only her own tired eyes. Jonah spent most of his time watching the camcorder. He did not turn it on. He did not charge it. He simply stared at it as if waiting for it to speak. Katie sat beside him one afternoon. She said she felt different when it was in the room. She said the light changed around it, even when the curtains were closed. Jonah nodded. He whispered that the camcorder had become something else. A window, a door, maybe both. Alan grew quieter each day. He left for work but often returned early. He would sit at the kitchen table with old maps and write small notes in the margins. Trails that had not existed. Dates that repeated. Sometimes he stared out the window for hours. When Marianne asked what he was looking at, he said he was watching for the next moment. That moment came in a whisper. It happened just before dawn. Katie stood in the hallway between the bathroom and her bedroom. She looked into the long hallway mirror and saw something move behind her. But when she turned, the hallway was empty. She looked back into the mirror and saw the trail, not their home, not the hallway. A forest path dim and green and narrow. It ran behind her reflection like a shadow. She backed away slowly. The image faded. The mirror showed only wallpaper and frame. She ran to wake Marianne. Marianne came quickly barefoot and still half asleep. She looked into the mirror but saw only herself. Katie explained what she had seen. She said the trail had reached inside. Marianne said nothing. She reached for her daughter's hand and led her back to bed. But afterward, she stayed awake. She watched the hallway. Nothing moved. Later that morning, Alan opened the mail and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the family standing in the circle of stones. They were not smiling. They were not looking at the camera. They looked tired, weighed down. Behind them, the forest leaned inward. He showed the photo to Marianne. She traced the edge of it with her finger. She said she remembered the moment, but not the photo. Jonah saw it last. He held it at arm's length. He said there was something behind the trees. Not a figure, not a shape, just a shift, a space where something should be but was not. He placed the photo on the table beside the camcorder. The camcorder flickered once. No one touched it. That night Jonah dreamed. He walked alone through the trail. The stones were broken. The moss was dry, but in the center stood a new figure. It had no face. It held the camcorder. It raised the device and spoke without a mouth. It said, "Remember the way you left." Jonah woke with his chest tight. He went to the living room and sat beside the camera. Katie joined him minutes later. She said she could not sleep. She said she dreamed of mirrors breaking, of voices crawling. The final morning arrived without warning. The city outside stretched into its usual rhythm. Cars crawled through traffic. The sky hovered in an indifferent gray. Inside the apartment, the Whitmore family moved quietly. Alan sat at the table staring at the photograph of them in the circle. Jonah stood at the window with his arms crossed. Katie walked the hallway, pausing at each doorframe. Marianne watched all three and said nothing. Something had shifted again. The camcorder had remained dark since the dream. No new files, no flickers, no sounds. Yet its presence felt heavier now, like an unopened letter resting at the center of a room. Alan placed the photograph back in the drawer. He looked at Jonah and asked if the dream had returned. Jonah shook his head. He said it did not need to. The message was already given. Katie spoke softly. She said the forest had one more path, one they had not taken, one they had never known was there. Marianne asked where it led. Katie said it led inward. That afternoon they took the train to the edge of the city. They did not pack bags. They brought nothing but the camcorder. Katie carried it wrapped in a gray towel. Alan walked ahead without speaking. Marianne kept a hand on Katie's shoulder. Jonah watched the sidewalk as they walked. They reached the edge of a long-abandoned playground. Rusted swings creaked in the breeze. Beyond the fence stood a narrow line of trees, a park that led nowhere, a forgotten corner. They passed through the broken gate. The trees thickened. The light changed. The city noise faded behind them. The trail appeared not with clarity, but with a quiet invitation. A gap in the trees, a thread of dry leaves and worn soil. They followed it. Alan did not question where it came from. Marianne did not ask how Katie knew the way. Jonah did not lift the camcorder. It remained in her arms. The trail wound gently upward. The air cooled. No birds sang. No branches cracked. It was not the same forest. It was not the same trail, but it knew them. Each step felt like a return, not to a place, but to a moment. The trees began to thin. The light grew stronger ahead. Then they reached a clearing. It was smaller than the circle of stones, but more complete. In the center stood a single tree, bare, its bark pale and smooth. Around its base were 12 stones. None glowed, none hummed. But their names were carved on each. Whitmore, 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 12 times. Katie stepped into the ring and placed the camcorder at the base of the tree. She turned and looked at her family. She said the forest did not take names. It remembered them. She said the loop had not been about the trail. It had been about the mirror. Marianne asked what needed to happen. Katie said they needed to speak their names one more time, together. Alan stepped forward. He spoke the name first, his voice steady. Marianne followed. Then Jonah, then Katie. The air stilled. The leaves did not move. The sky above dimmed slightly as if dusk had taken hold early. Then the tree began to change. The bark darkened at its core. Lines spread outward from its center. Faint at first, then deeper, like veins, like stories. A shape formed, a door, not one with hinges, not wood, not stone. A doorway in the shape of an opening, a suggestion, a memory. Katie stepped closer. She reached out and placed her hand on the surface. It did not resist. It rippled slightly under her palm. She said this was not a way back. This was the way forward. Marianne asked what they would find. Katie said they would find what the forest remembered best. Not the fear, not the silence, The moment they chose to turn toward each other, Alan placed his hand beside Katie's, then Jonah, then Marianne. The doorway warmed beneath their skin. The silence lifted, not with sound, but with release. The weight they had carried since Black Hollow began to lift, not erased, not forgotten, known, held. The tree did not vanish, the stones did not crumble, but the clearing grew quiet in a new way, a way that allowed breathing. Katie stepped through first. She vanished into the light. Jonah followed without looking back. Alan took Marianne's hand. They stepped forward together. The clearing stood empty. The tree closed behind them. They walked now through memory made whole. They passed no markers, no stones, only scenes. Katie as a child laughing under summer rain. Jonah asleep beneath a blanket beside a window. Alan holding a photograph in his hand. Marianne singing softly beside a stove. Moments layered over one another. No time, no urgency, just recognition. Each of them touched these moments, not to keep them, not to change them, to know them. Then the trail appeared again. A final one. Not through forest, through self. Katie walked ahead, the others behind. The path led to light, not bright, not blinding, gentle, clear. At the edge of the trail stood a bench. Upon it sat the camcorder. It was no longer heavy, no longer humming. It was silent. Katie picked it up. She pressed the button. The screen lit up with the final message. One line. You are not lost. You are remembered. She turned and looked at her family. Jonah smiled. Alan placed a hand on her shoulder. Marianne closed her eyes and breathed deeply. They stepped into the light together. Far behind them, the clearing with the tree remained. The stones held the names gently, not as warnings, as memory. The forest did not close, it did not disappear, it waited, it would always wait. But for the first time in a long time, it no longer held breath. It exhaled. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more haunting tales like this. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened and where you're watching from. We read every comment and love hearing your theories.